Unit 5, Part 4. So we just ran through 1B, exercise 1B from page 192, doing a truth table test for the validity of this argument form. We did find a counterexample, so let me state very clearly again, what do you do in the exam? How do you answer the question on the exam? Right? The exam question will be something like, use the full truth table method to test the following argument form for validity, right? And you'll be given the list of statement forms and conclusion. You will have to write them up, right? A column for each statement form, as so. Leave space between, leave a lot of space, because in ones like, we're going to do 1D in a minute, you see the second premise here, where there's a bit more complexity, there's another layer of complexity. We're going to first have to calculate the value here, so that we're going to want to have a whole truth table column under here, under the not Q, and then we're going to be looking at the value of that, and also the value of P to determine whether P or not Q is true. So we another column under here, right? So leave space, because otherwise, because you're going to have columns of truth tables under every operator, basically, and they're going to get to squish together. And right, as I'll stress, it's going to be important which column you look at in determining whether you've got a counterexample or not. And you're more likely to make a mistake, to not be focusing on the right thing, not be focusing on the right column, if you don't spread them out. So make sure you sort of spread out your formulas when you write them down. Compute the truth table column for each operator, right? When you've completed the truth table, inspect, like a terminator. Do you have an example? Do you have a row where all premises come out true and conclusion false? If you do, like we did in this third row, what do? This is crucial, because this is the thing that I see, right? You'll point to it, you'll have an arrow or a star around like this, or both, whatever, right? Make sure you tell me that you have seen this row, point to it, and what do you conclude? You write. This is a counterexample. This shows that the argument form is invalid. Okay. Again, let me say, you have not grasped theoretically what's going on if you say something like, or you think something like, oh, it's in, so this is a mistaken thing to say. It's a mistake to say, this argument form is invalid when P is false and Q is true, right, on this substitution instance. But it's valid here, and it's valid here, it's valid on these substitution instances. No, that is incorrect, right? So again, remember where we started. Chapter 1, Unit 1, Sections 4 and 5, right? The definition of validity, the stress was on the modal notions, the modal notion of necessity and possibility, right? So two different equivalent expressions of what a valid argument is. It's one where it's necessarily the case that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. It's a valid argument is one where it's not possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion false. And how do we get a handle on that necessity or that or that impossibility? We do so through the notion of form, right? Remember, Unit 1, Section 5 was on truth and validity, and you had to distinguish your understanding of the truth of the sentences, right? Whether the sentences are true or false. Distinguish the question of the truth or falsity of the sentences making up the argument from the question of the validity of the argument, right? And I presented you in the lectures on Unit 1 examples of valid arguments where it was false, 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 right? Because it was, if those premises are true, they would force the conclusion to be true, right? So you can still have a valid argument with false premises, and you could also have an invalid argument where the premise is true and the conclusion is true, right? Right. So you have to divorce your conception of truth or falsity of the sentences from the question of validity. So those were to bring you to a better, more intuitive understanding of the necessity or the impossible, it is not possible part, right? The modal understanding of the validity of the argument. It's necessarily the case if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. It's a valid argument is one where it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And how do we understand that? How do we know that it's necessary? How do we know that it's not possible for a valid argument? Right? When we can have valid arguments where the premises are true and the conclusion is right. When we can have valid arguments where they're all false, where we can have invalid arguments, right? How do we know this possibility? Through the notion of argument of the argument form, right? We're explicating, right? We're getting a handle on our sense of that necessity, that impossibility, which constitutes our understanding of validity. We're getting a handle of it on it when we say a particular argument is valid if and only if its form is valid, and its form is valid if and only if it has no counterexamples, right? The no counterexamples is the necessity, right? The no counterexamples is sort of our explication of the impossibility of true premises and a false conclusion, okay? So that's why, once again, as I stressed already in Unit 1, this was a crucial part of the doctrine of Unit 1, understand that if you know, an argument, any particular argument is valid if and only if its form is valid. Its form is valid if and only if it doesn't have any counterexamples. But if you have a counterexample to an argument form, then every instance of that form is invalid.